In the shadow-laden halls of Renaissance Florence, where conspiracies whispered through marble corridors and alliances shifted like morning mist, Niccolò Machiavelli understood a truth that would echo through centuries: power is not given, it is taken. But, before one can grasp the reins of external dominion, one must first conquer the greatest fortress of all, the self. The year was 1513, and Machiavelli sat in exile at his small estate in Sant'Andrea, watching the sun cast long shadows across the Tuscan hills. Stripped of his position in the Florentine Republic, disgraced and suspected of conspiracy, he faced a choice that would define not only his legacy but the very nature of human ambition. He could surrender to bitterness, allowing his circumstances to define him, or he could forge himself anew in the crucible of adversity. It was here, in this moment of profound vulnerability, that the first and most crucial principle emerged: the weak self must be destroyed before it can be destroyed by others. This destruction is not the mindless demolition of character, but rather the surgical removal of those qualities that render a person powerless in the face of fortune's wheel. Fear, self-doubt, the desperate need for approval, the paralysis of perfectionism, these are the enemies within that must be conquered before any external battle can be won. Consider the merchant Marco Benedetti, who operated in the volatile markets of 15th-century Venice. Each morning, he faced the same internal struggle that plagued countless others: the voice that whispered of inadequacy, the trembling hand that hesitated to sign contracts worth thousands of florins, the sleepless nights spent agonizing over decisions that required decisive action. Marco's business rivals sensed this weakness like sharks sensing blood in water. They exploited his hesitation, undercut his deals while he deliberated, and gradually eroded his market position. But Marco possessed one crucial advantage: he had studied the writings of ancient strategists and understood that his greatest enemy was not the competition across the piazza, but the frightened merchant who stared back at him from polished bronze mirrors each morning. The transformation began with a simple recognition: that version of himself had to die. Principle 1: Embrace calculated ruthlessness. The first step in this internal revolution involves understanding that ruthlessness is not cruelty for its own sake, but rather the willingness to make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by sentiment or false morality. When Marco faced the choice between maintaining unprofitable relationships with longtime suppliers or cutting ties to save his enterprise, he chose preservation over sentiment. The old Marco would have agonized for months, slowly bleeding resources while hoping circumstances would somehow improve. The new Marco made the cut cleanly and quickly, understanding that a moment's pain prevented years of suffering. This principle extends far beyond business dealings. In personal relationships, calculated ruthlessness might mean ending friendships that drain energy without providing mutual benefit, or refusing to enable destructive behavior in family members out of misplaced loyalty. It means recognizing that saying no is often the kindest word in any language, both for oneself and for others who might otherwise exploit perceived weakness. The key word here is calculated. Machiavelli never advocated for random acts of cruelty or the abandonment of all moral consideration. Rather, he understood that effectiveness often requires actions that appear harsh to those who have never held real responsibility. A surgeon who hesitates to make necessary incisions out of sympathy will kill more patients than one who cuts decisively where cutting is required. Principle 2: Master the art of strategic deception. Truth, in the Machiavellian framework, is not about rigid honesty but about strategic revelation of information. This does not mean becoming a pathological liar, but rather understanding that complete transparency is often a luxury that leaders cannot afford. When Lorenzo de' Medici negotiated with rival city-states, he understood that revealing his complete hand would not demonstrate honesty, it would demonstrate foolishness. Strategic deception takes many forms. Sometimes it means allowing others to maintain their illusions about your capabilities until the moment when revealing your true strength serves your purposes. Sometimes it means presenting multiple possible courses of action while keeping your true intentions hidden until commitment becomes irreversible. Most importantly, it means understanding that your internal thoughts and external presentation need not always align. Elena Rossi learned this principle the hard way during her rise through the banking houses of Florence. Initially, she believed that transparent communication would earn her respect and advancement. She shared her strategic insights freely, openly discussed her ambitions, and honestly assessed both her own capabilities and those of her colleagues. The result was predictable: rivals appropriated her ideas without attribution, superiors viewed her ambition as threatening rather than valuable, and her honest assessments made enemies of those she had accurately critiqued. The transformation came when Elena began to understand that information is a form of currency, and, like any currency, its value depends partly on scarcity. She learned to share insights selectively, revealing enough to demonstrate competence while maintaining mystery about the full extent of her capabilities. She learned to express ambitions in ways that aligned with others' interests rather than threatening them. Most importantly, she learned that timing is everything. The same truth that destroys relationships when spoken prematurely can cement alliances when revealed at the proper moment. Principle 3. Cultivate controlled anger. The conventional wisdom teaches that anger is weakness, that emotional control means the absence of strong feeling. Machiavelli understood something more nuanced: that anger, properly channeled, becomes one of the most potent forces for personal transformation and external influence. The key lies not in suppression but in direction. Uncontrolled anger scatters energy in all directions, accomplishing little beyond temporary satisfaction and long-term regret. Controlled anger focuses that same energy like sunlight through a magnifying glass, capable of igniting change that would be impossible through cool reason alone. When Cesare Borgia learned of betrayal among his lieutenants, he did not rage like a madman or plot elaborate revenge fantasies. Instead, he channeled his fury into systematic action, methodically removing each source of disloyalty while ensuring that the lesson was unmistakable to those who remained. This principle applies equally to personal development. The anger that arises from recognizing one's own limitations can be channeled into disciplined improvement. The fury that comes from watching others succeed while you stagnate can fuel the relentless effort required for transformation. The rage that accompanies injustice can power sustained action toward creating more favorable conditions. Antonio Vinci, a young lawyer in Renaissance Milan, discovered this truth when a more connected rival obtained a position that should have been his based on merit. His initial response was the typical one: self-pity mixed with unfocused resentment. But, as he observed his own reactions, he realized that this anger contained tremendous energy if properly directed. Instead of wasting it on complaint and bitterness, he used it to fuel an intensive period of skill development and network building. The anger that could have poisoned his spirit became the driving force behind his eventual rise to a position far superior to the one he had initially lost. The cultivation of controlled anger requires practice and self-awareness. It begins with recognizing anger as information, a signal that something in your environment is not serving your interests, rather than as an emotion to be immediately expressed or suppressed. It continues with learning to extract the energy while filtering out the destructiveness. It culminates in the ability to maintain that focused intensity over extended periods, using it to power sustained effort toward specific objectives. Part 2. The architecture of influence. As the weak self dies and a more formidable version emerges, the next challenge becomes understanding how to operate effectively in a world where everyone else is also pursuing their own interests. This is where Machiavelli's insights into human nature become invaluable, revealing patterns of behavior that remain as relevant today as they were 5 centuries ago. Principle 4. Understand the currency of human motivation. Every person operates according to their own internal economy of desires, fears, and incentives. The master strategist learns to read these patterns as accurately as a banker reads ledgers, understanding what each individual truly values and what they genuinely fear. This knowledge becomes the foundation for all successful influence. Consider the case of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, later Pope Paul III, as he navigated the treacherous waters of Vatican politics in the early 16th century. Rather than assuming that his colleagues were motivated purely by spiritual concerns or simple ambition, he invested considerable time in understanding the specific desires that drove each key player. Some craved recognition and public honor. Others sought security for their families. Still others were motivated by genuine theological concerns or by more earthly pleasures. Armed with this understanding, Farnese could craft approaches that spoke directly to each person's primary motivations. When dealing with someone motivated by family security, he discussed how his proposals would create stable conditions for the next generation. When engaging with those driven by honor, he framed initiatives in terms of legacy and recognition. When working with the theologically motivated, he emphasized spiritual implications and moral considerations.
This principle extends far beyond high-stakes political maneuvering. In any workplace, relationship, or community, the same dynamics apply. The colleague who appears motivated by money might actually be driven by a need for respect. The friend who seems self-sufficient might be deeply motivated by a desire for belonging. The family member who resists change might be primarily motivated by fear of loss rather than stubborn attachment to the status quo. Master practitioners of this principle develop what might be called motivational literacy, the ability to quickly identify what truly drives others and to communicate in ways that resonate with those underlying motivations. This is not manipulation in the negative sense, but rather communication that acknowledges reality rather than projecting one's own motivational patterns onto others. Principle 5. Build asymmetric alliances. The traditional approach to relationships emphasizes equality and mutual benefit. While these have their place, Machiavelli understood that the most powerful alliances are often asymmetric partnerships where each party brings different strengths and receives different benefits, creating bonds that are difficult for competitors to break or replicate. Isabella d'Este, perhaps the most politically astute woman of the Italian Renaissance, mastered this principle in her management of Mantua. Rather than seeking alliances with equal powers who would inevitably become rivals, she cultivated relationships with entities that complemented her strengths and compensated for her weaknesses. She allied with Venice for naval power while maintaining separate agreements with France for land-based military support. She developed cultural partnerships with Florence while maintaining economic relationships with Milan. Each alliance served different purposes and involved different forms of exchange. Venice received intelligence about land-based threats in exchange for naval protection. France received staging areas and local knowledge in exchange for military backing. Florence received patronage and cultural exchange in exchange for artistic and intellectual collaboration. Milan received stable trade relationships in exchange for economic cooperation. The genius of this approach lay in its sustainability. Because each alliance served different needs and involved different currencies of exchange, none of them directly threatened the others. Competitors found it nearly impossible to disrupt her network because doing so would require offering superior alternatives across multiple dimensions simultaneously. In contemporary contexts, this might mean building professional relationships with mentors, peers, and protégés simultaneously, each providing different forms of value and support. It might mean developing personal friendships based on different shared interests rather than seeking one person who meets all social needs. It might mean creating business partnerships where one party provides expertise while another provides resources, and still another provides market access. Principle 6. Perfect. The art of strategic timing. Fortune, Machiavelli observed, is like a river. When it floods, it seems irresistible, sweeping away everything in its path. But the wise leader prepares for floods by building channels and dikes during calm periods, creating structures that can direct the torrent when it comes. This understanding of timing, knowing when to act decisively and when to wait patiently, separates effective leaders from those who either move too quickly or hesitate too long. The merchant prince Cosimo de' Medici built his banking empire partly through extraordinary sensitivity to timing. He understood that there were moments when aggressive expansion was possible and profitable, and other moments when consolidation and patience were required. When political conditions in a region were stable and growth opportunities were clear, he moved quickly to establish new branches and relationships. When instability threatened, he pulled back, securing existing operations and waiting for conditions to improve. This temporal intelligence required constant observation of multiple factors simultaneously. Cosimo tracked not just economic indicators but also political developments, social trends, seasonal patterns, and competitive dynamics. He understood that the same action that would fail catastrophically at one moment might succeed brilliantly at another. The principle of strategic timing operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the tactical level, it might mean knowing when in a conversation to introduce a difficult topic, or when during a project to request additional resources. On the strategic level, it might mean understanding when to launch a new initiative or when to change careers. On the grand strategic level, it might mean recognizing when entire industries or ways of life are shifting, creating opportunities for those who move at exactly the right moment. Developing temporal intelligence requires cultivating patience without passivity.
It means being prepared to act quickly when opportunities arise while being willing to wait for the right opportunities rather than forcing action in inappropriate circumstances. It requires accepting that some goals can only be achieved over extended time periods, while others must be pursued with immediate intensity. Principle 7. Creates systematic leverage. Power, in the Machiavellian understanding, is not simply about personal capabilities or resources. It is about creating systems that amplify individual effort and extend influence beyond what direct action alone could achieve. The most enduring forms of power come from establishing structures that continue to work even when active attention is directed elsewhere. Pope Julius II, the warrior pope, demonstrated this principle as he rebuilt papal authority in the early 16th century. Rather than relying solely on his personal charisma or temporary military victories, he systematically created structures that would maintain papal power regardless of who occupied the throne. He established new administrative systems that increased efficiency and reduced corruption. He commissioned artistic projects that would serve as permanent symbols of papal authority. He negotiated treaties that created lasting obligations rather than temporary accommodations. Each element of this systematic approach reinforced the others. The improved administration made the papal states more prosperous, generating resources that could fund both military activities and artistic patronage. The artistic patronage created symbols of power that influenced both subjects and rivals. The military victories created conditions for favorable treaty negotiations. The treaties created stable frameworks for continued prosperity. In contemporary contexts, systematic leverage might involve building professional reputations that generate opportunities without constant self-promotion. It might mean creating business processes that produce results without requiring constant personal intervention. It might mean developing expertise that becomes increasingly valuable over time rather than requiring constant updates to remain relevant. The key insight is that sustainable power comes from systems rather than individual actions. A person who must personally convince each potential ally, personally oversee each important decision, and personally intervene in each significant challenge will eventually reach the limits of individual capacity. A person who creates systems that identify potential allies, frameworks that guide important decisions, and processes that handle routine challenges can extend their influence far beyond personal limitations. Part 3. The Mastery of Fortune. The final stage of Machiavellian development involves learning to work with uncertainty and change rather than being overwhelmed by them. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the philosophy to master because it requires accepting that complete control is impossible while simultaneously taking maximum responsibility for outcomes. Principle 8. Embrace productive paranoia. The line between healthy caution and destructive paranoia lies not in the level of vigilance but in its focus and productivity. Destructive paranoia sees threats everywhere, leading to paralysis and the inability to form necessary relationships or take calculated risks. Productive paranoia, by contrast, systematically identifies real vulnerabilities and takes concrete steps to address them before they become critical problems. Francesco Sforza, who rose from mercenary captain to Duke of Milan, exemplified this principle throughout his career. He maintained extensive intelligence networks not because he enjoyed spying or distrusted everyone around him, but because he understood that information about developing threats was essential for effective leadership. When he learned of potential conspiracies, he did not respond with blind suppression but, rather with careful investigation followed by precisely calibrated responses. Productive paranoia operates on the assumption that threats will emerge not because the world is fundamentally evil, but because conflicting interests are a natural part of any complex environment. By accepting this reality rather than hoping it away, the paranoid leader can prepare for challenges while still maintaining the relationships and taking the risks that success requires. In modern contexts, this might mean regularly reviewing personal financial security not out of obsessive worry about money, but out of recognition that economic stability provides options during difficult periods. It might mean maintaining professional relationships across multiple industries or companies rather than becoming completely dependent on a single source of income. It might mean developing diverse skills rather than overspecializing in areas that might become obsolete. The practice of productive paranoia requires distinguishing between preparation and worry. Worry is emotional energy spent on problems without taking action to address them.
Preparation is systematic effort invested in reducing vulnerabilities and expanding options. The productively paranoid leader spends little time worrying because they spend significant time preparing. Principle 9. Develop anti-fragile resilience. Most approaches to resilience focus on the ability to withstand shocks and return to previous conditions. Machiavellian resilience goes further, seeking to create systems and mindsets that actually benefit from disorder and challenge. This is what the modern thinker Nassim Taleb would later call anti-fragility, the ability to gain from chaos rather than merely surviving it. Consider how Niccolò Machiavelli himself responded to his political exile. Rather than simply enduring the hardship or attempting to return to his previous position unchanged, he used the forced leisure to study history, develop new insights, and write works that would influence leaders for centuries. His exile, initially appearing to be pure misfortune, became the source of his greatest contribution to human understanding. This transformation required a fundamental shift in perspective. Instead of viewing his circumstances as purely negative, Machiavelli began to see them as containing hidden opportunities. The loss of day-to-day political responsibilities gave him time for deep reflection that would have been impossible while managing immediate crises. His distance from current events allowed him to see patterns that might have remained invisible if he had remained embedded in the system. Anti-fragile resilience involves several key elements. First, it requires maintaining multiple options rather than depending on single sources of security or success. Second, it demands developing the ability to quickly identify opportunities that arise from disruption. Third, it necessitates building systems that can not only withstand shocks but actually grow stronger from them. The merchant families that survived and thrived during the economic upheavals of the Renaissance typically demonstrated this anti-fragile quality. When trade routes were disrupted by war, they found new markets. When traditional industries declined, they invested in emerging technologies. When political changes threatened existing partnerships, they formed new alliances. They understood that stability was an illusion and that lasting success came from the ability to benefit from change rather than resist it. Principle 10. Master the integration of virtue and vice. The final and, perhaps most sophisticated principle involves transcending simple moral categories to understand how apparent virtues can become weaknesses when taken to extremes, while apparent vices can serve virtuous purposes when properly applied. This is not moral relativism but, rather moral sophistication, the recognition that effectiveness often requires combining seemingly contradictory qualities. Cesare Borgia, despite his fearsome reputation, demonstrated this integration throughout his campaigns. He could be extraordinarily generous when generosity served strategic purposes, winning loyalty from subordinates and subjects alike. But, he could also be ruthlessly decisive when mercy would be interpreted as weakness and would ultimately lead to greater suffering for more people. His contemporaries found him unpredictable precisely because he refused to be limited by simplistic behavioral patterns. The key insight is that every virtue contains the seeds of its own destruction when practiced without wisdom and proportion. Honesty becomes harmful when it serves no purpose except self-expression. Loyalty becomes destructive when it prevents recognition of changing circumstances. Courage becomes reckless when it ignores legitimate risks. Compassion becomes enabling when it prevents necessary difficult actions. Similarly, apparent vices can serve noble purposes when properly directed. Strategic deception can protect innocent parties from harm. Controlled anger can motivate necessary changes. Calculated selfishness can ensure that one has resources available to help others when help is needed. Temporary cruelty can prevent longer-term suffering. This integration requires developing what might be called contextual wisdom, the ability to understand which qualities serve which purposes under specific circumstances. It means abandoning rigid behavioral rules in favor of flexible principles that can be adapted to changing situations. The diplomat and scholar Baldassare Castiglione exemplified this sophisticated approach in his work at various Renaissance courts. He could be charming and diplomatic when building alliances, but firm and direct when defending important principles. He could display humility when learning from others, but confidence when his expertise was needed. He could show compassion for human weakness, but demand excellence in important matters.
This integration is perhaps the most difficult aspect of Machiavellian thinking to master because it requires abandoning the psychological comfort that comes from simple moral rules. It demands accepting the complexity and ambiguity that characterize most important decisions. It requires developing the judgment to know when apparent contradictions are actually complementary aspects of a more sophisticated approach to effectiveness. The person who masters this final principle becomes truly formidable not through any single outstanding quality, but through the ability to access and deploy whatever qualities a situation requires. They become unpredictable to enemies because their responses are not limited by rigid patterns, while remaining trustworthy to allies because their actions are guided by consistent underlying principles even when surface behaviors vary. The ultimate goal of this integration is not to become amoral but to become more effective in serving whatever moral purposes one chooses to pursue. The leader who can be both gentle and firm, both generous and demanding, both trusting and cautious, depending on circumstances, can accomplish far more good in the world than one limited to a narrower range of responses. This sophisticated morality requires constant attention to consequences rather than simple adherence to rules. It means asking not just, is this action virtuous according to traditional standards, but, will this action, in these specific circumstances, produce results that serve my ultimate values and purposes? It means taking full responsibility for outcomes rather than hiding behind the excuse that good intentions should be enough. The man who destroys his weak self through the application of these 10 principles does not become heartless or amoral. Rather, he becomes someone whose heart is guided by wisdom rather than mere sentiment, whose morality is sophisticated rather than simplistic, and whose effectiveness serves purposes larger than personal comfort or social approval. He becomes, in short, someone who cannot be destroyed by others because he has already chosen to destroy everything in himself that could serve as a target for destruction. In the end, Machiavelli's greatest insight was not about politics or power in their conventional senses, but about the transformation of human potential. He understood that most people live far below their actual capabilities, limited not by external circumstances but by internal constraints they have never chosen to confront. The principles he outlined provide a systematic approach to breaking through those constraints, creating individuals who are not only more effective in pursuing their goals but also more resilient in the face of challenges and more capable of contributing meaningfully to whatever communities they choose to serve. The weak self that must be destroyed is not the authentic self but, rather, the fearful, limited, and reactive version of the self that emerges from unconscious acceptance of unnecessary limitations. The strong self that emerges from this destruction is not harsh or unfeeling but, rather, capable, sophisticated, and free to choose responses based on wisdom rather than automatic patterns developed in response to past hurts or fears. This transformation is never complete or final. The principles must be practiced continuously, adapted to changing circumstances, and refined through experience and reflection. But, for those willing to undertake this demanding work, the rewards extend far beyond personal advancement or protection from external threats. They include the deep satisfaction that comes from living with greater awareness, effectiveness, and purpose, the satisfaction of becoming more fully human rather than remaining trapped in the narrow confines of who one happened to be before conscious development began. The man who destroys his weak self through this process becomes, ultimately, indestructible not because he cannot be harmed or challenged, but because he has eliminated the internal vulnerabilities that would make such harm or challenges capable of destroying what matters most about him. He has created, through disciplined choice and sustained effort, a version of himself that can adapt to whatever circumstances arise while remaining fundamentally intact and capable of continued growth and contribution. This is the ultimate promise of Machiavellian thinking. Not mere survival or success in any conventional sense, but the transformation of human potential into actual capability, of fearful reactivity into wise responsiveness, of unconscious limitation into conscious choice about what kind of person to become and what kind of life to create.